Welcome to this fifth talk on the history of Germany between 1815 and 2015. We've moved on from the First World War now and going towards the post-Adenauer years, especially in West Germany, which is what this talk will focus on. After the authoritarian continuity of the 1950s with Adenauer in charge, we get a great deal of change. Initially, Erhard, the finance minister, takes over, and after the 65 election, a grand coalition is set up between the SPD, the centre-left party, and the CDU, the centre-right party. And effectively, imagine some black Conservatives and the Labour Party coming together as one to form one party. This actually lasted for 4 years. We'll come back to some of the issues that came up from this a bit later on. In 1969, the CDU actually won the election, but the SPD managed to form a coalition between themselves and the Free Democrat Party, the Centre Party, and a government was created under Willy Brandt, who was the leader of the SPD at the time. This was seen as a major breakthrough, as it was the first time the SPD had been in government since the early 1930s. This felt a major breakthrough for them. And it was also seen as a reforming government, because a number of social reforms were brought about as a result. In 1974, Brandt is forced to resign in a spy scandal, although there's no general election, and the SPD continue in power with the FPD till 1982 with Helmut Schmidt as Chancellor. In 82, there is a disagreement over the budget between the coalition partners, and a vote of no confidence brings the CDU's Helmut Kohl to power, who he wins nearly 50% of the vote in the next general election of 83, and there's a breakthrough for the Green Party. More about them a bit later. There's a move to the right in the 1980s, accompanied by efforts to cast off the stigma of Nazism and take pride in being German, but even that creates a great deal of controversy. I mentioned before that the early part of this period, the Grand Coalition, brought about a number of problems, and this was because there was no effective opposition. If you think about the two main parties are in coalition with one another, there is no opposition in the sense that there had to be an extra parliamentary opposition, and this was done by the youth, the students in West Germany at that time. This was a phenomenon that was going across many different Western countries and non-Western countries as well. Key date, of course, is 1968, where there are large-scale demonstrations in German cities. This is reflected, as I mentioned before, in major demonstrations in Chicago, in London, especially in Paris, especially in Prague, and especially in Mexico. Germany is also seen as a major flashpoint. The major difference here is not just the key terms we can see there of anti-nuclear weapons, anti-Vietnam War, and greater student democracy, but also because there was a revolt against their parents. The key thing here was, the question they asked was, what did you do in the war, Daddy? The difference, of course, when the students in Britain, France, to some degree, and America said, what did you do in the war? They were on the winning side, but if the German youth asked that, of course, many of their parents were involved in the Nazi party in various different levels. And of course, that was a revolt in itself, to sort of say, well, these people are still in power. We need to break completely free from this. There was a great deal of political violence prior to the 68 demonstrations. The papers by Axel Springer was attacked and burnt down. That's the equivalent of the Sun. And there was a great deal of violence against students' demonstrations, culminating in the killing by Unesorg, a student, by police. This was justified by counter-violence in many radicals' minds, in the sense that they would now use violence. The police were using violence against them, they would use violence. Rudi Dutschke, who was one of the key student leaders, socialist student leaders at this time, there was an attempted assassination on him in Berlin in 1968. He survived that for a good 10 years, although he was largely paralysed. Student politics was key to a lot of this, especially in Berlin. In the rest of West Germany, there was military. The fact that people had to join the army or any types of military from the ages of 18. The only, in terms of conscription, the only place you didn't have to do that was Berlin, West Berlin. So many people drifted towards West Berlin, and of course this became a centre for radical thought and action. One of the key ideas that Deutschke brings about was this idea of the long march through the institutions, not necessarily being in complete opposition to the institutions, but joining the institutions and changing it from within. And this is how, to some extent, the Green Party functioned. More about them a bit later. On the flip side of this was political violence by the far left through the what became known as the Red Army faction or the Rote Army faction, better known as the Baader-Meinhof gang. There was a number of initially bank robberies, then assassinations by what we call the first generation, who we can see there, the key ones being Ulrike Meinhof and Baader, as well as Enslin, who was the three key characters, people leading the Baader-Meinhof gang. They were all captured by 1973, and so the second generation came through, much more violent, much more focused on assassinations, targeted symbols of capitalism such as bankers, but also the US military as well. The RAF and the Palestinian Liberation Organization had hijacked a Lufthansa plane in Mogadishu, which was foiled by German special forces acting outside of Germany for the first time since 1945. The RAF leadership, who were in prison at that time, all committed suicide on hearing the news of this foiled attempt. Sorry, just go back a bit there. Ulrike, here you can see a photograph of Ulrike Meinhof and Enslin and Baader. The 1977 period was known as the German Autumn. This is where I mentioned before about the Mogadishu hijacking and the assassination of Schleyer, who was a business leader and a hostage. Eventually, as I said, the Lufthansa airliner was taken back by special forces. Almost straight away, the leadership of the Red Army faction committed suicide, and Schleyer was executed in reprisal to this. Having said that, the second generation realised that they couldn't move in the same way, and so to some extent, only some extent, there was a levelling off of the violence, certainly in the late 70s and early 80s. This was the other branch, because it was the beginning of the long march through the institutions, as Deutschke called it. This was mirrored across Western Europe in terms of anti-nuclear movements and green movements, but more so in Germany. They became quite a strong force. You have the creation of the Die Grünen Party, or the Ecology Party initially, in response to the oil crisis in 1973, the fact that petrol prices were escalating very, very rapidly in both 1973 and 1979, creating an energy crisis in Western Europe, which to some extent brings down the sort of 1945 compromise and belief that social democracy was the path forward. Much more right-wing ideas gained a hold throughout the 70s, especially in the 80s with the rise of Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan and Helmut Kohl in Germany. We see here the Green Breakthrough and eventually in 1998 actually being part of a government, a red-green government, in terms of coalition with the SPD, including Joschka Fischer as foreign minister. And again, in 2005, the Greens are ousted by the CDU-SPD Grand Coalition. They are still there and still seen as a force to be reckoned with. So, what can we say in response to all of this? Well, we can definitely say that Federal Republic West Germany became a stable parliamentary democracy, although there was continuity with the past, particularly under Adenauer. There was rapid economic recovery leading to prosperity, but this brought about its own problems in terms of student unrest and high taxes. Carr, historian, said of West Germany, it was a viable democracy with a distinctly conservative coloration. One of the key aspects, policies pursued, especially by Willy Brandt and then by his successors, was the one of Ostpolitik. What were the reasons for Ostpolitik? Well, the mayor of West Berlin had been Willy Brandt, and he had to negotiate with East Germany and East Berlin because it was right next to him on its doorstep, and he believed there had to be some form of rapprochement or meeting of minds with the East rather than to completely ignore it, as West Germany had done under the Hallstein Doctrine pursued by Adenauer. This was also mirrored by movements in Western diplomacy and Eastern diplomacy in the 1960s to avoid any possibility of nuclear war. What we see is détente coming about by the superpowers, both the United States and the Soviet Union. Although this was very controversial in terms of Ostpolitik, because many in the CDU and to some extent some in the SPD didn't believe this should take place. What was the impact of Ostpolitik? Another architect was Hans-Dietrich Genscher, who died fairly recently, only in 2015. Was foreign minister and leader of the FDP and was the foreign minister, as I say, between 1974 and 1992. So you can see a great deal of continuity in this. The policy of Ostpolitik was continued by Helmut Schmidt, Willy Brandt's SPD successor, especially at the Helsinki conference, where you can see a photograph here of Schmidt on the left, and Honecker, who was the leader of the GDR, sat on his left. We can see on the right hand side. This wouldn't have happened maybe 10 years before. This meant that because they were talking, pressure could be applied on the East and greater human rights could be gained from this. However, this did mean that they had to accept the division of Germany, and two very different paths had been taken by both states. Both sides did criticise each other and kept up with preparations for the possibility of nuclear war, including the building of the new nuclear shelter in West Berlin in 1973, capable of housing 20,000 people.